Hello, everyone. We were just a couple of minutes late because we were working out what we were going to talk about, but there's so much going on that it's kind of often just sorting through a whole bunch of really interesting little snippets to try to create something that's going to sustain us over the next hour. But welcome everyone to our fortnightly tech talk. We've got my regular partner in crime, Lizzie O'Shea, from her beautiful study in Melbourne, and Dan Stinton from Guardian Australia back with us after a couple of weeks R&R. Welcome everybody. Paying respects to traditional owners. I'm on Gadigal land up here in Sydney. Wherever you are, I'm sure you'll join me in paying respects to elders past, present, emerging, and recognising the land we're all on was never ceded. Today, we've kind of got three different verticals that all sort of talk to different elements of, I guess, what we put under the broad rubric of tech. One around thinking through the way that AI is developing, with particular reference to a new set of standards that have been introduced by the European Parliament. So we'll kick that around a little bit. The second part of today's discussion is actually looking at more the manufacturing of hard bits of technology, particularly chips, and the notion of Chippageddon, that there's this critical shortage of chips and what that's going to mean. And the third part of our conversation will look at some of the perennially spiky issues around moderation and responsibility for content on social networks, particularly the one that's run by Mark Zuckerberg. Before we get in, hi guys. Great to have you all in the virtual town hall. Lizzie, what's been going on with you?
Oh, you know,
open-ended question. Yeah.
Busy as always. For what it's worth, it's Privacy Awareness Week next week in Victoria. I'm going to be doing an event with the a couple of people, including some people from Challenger Privacy, the Chief Information Officer, and essentially the Data and Information Commissioner. So it'll be a really nice event to talk about these things. I think it's really important to talk about privacy. So if you're interested, feel free to come along. But yeah, we're going well in Melbourne, just making sure privacy is front and centre next week.
Yeah. I also noticed you're doing a surveillance walking tour of Melbourne. Is that for next week?
That's true.
There is an opportunity for our tech talkers that are Melbourne based to come and take to the streets with you.
You're absolutely right. It's actually on a weekend, but I'll post a link in the chat. It's for Melbourne Knowledge Week, and it's like a guided tour of the city, looking at how surveillance is in our everyday lives, in our lived environment. So it's been put together by our staff member Lucy and Sam. You've probably seen Lucy in some of these tech talks. I'm really excited to participate, and yeah, it'll be a great kind of way to understand the city through the lens of surveillance. And
so you're going around looking at cameras and things?
That sort of thing, exactly. I mean, I think it's shocking how much surveillance occurs in our lived environment with almost no oversight, and how it creeps into our lives. So becoming aware of it is the first step to, I think, starting to come to terms with the policy implications.
Outstanding. Dan, what's been going on with you?
This is a very open-ended way to start things.
I know, I'm very loose today.
Look, I guess the parts of my world that's relevant for this conversation is I'm finalising my long-form agreements with Google off the back of Lizzie's favourite, the News Media Bargaining Code, and hoping to have that wrapped up in a couple of weeks, which is good, and finalising plans for an expansion off the back of that, including a very large number of journalists. And I won't say how many, but what I can say is we have just taken over the second floor of our building in Sydney, where we're based, and probably going to have to move our Melbourne office as well. So that's quite exciting, and I'm continuing to negotiate with my good friends at Facebook around a subsequent deal as well. So otherwise, pretty heavily involved in still in talking to people about the privacy side of things. There is a lot of conversation going on in the advertising industry, which is where I sort of spend most of my time. A lot of momentum building actually for the purpose limitations that I've been banging on about, and trying to put some guardrails around the use of or collection and use of consumer data. So I'm a bit encouraged by where it's going.
That's outstanding. And ACCC, it seems every week, is putting out calls for another paper. So that whole momentum about their regulation of platforms through competition law seems like it's moving through the system. There was calls for submissions this week on the choice of screen. I don't know if it's a rule or a prohibition, but the preloading of Google onto screens, and which is one of the anchor points of one of the big antitrust cases in America, but obviously in Australia it's prevalent as well, and there's action moving on that. And we won't talk about ACCC today because I think we've done it to death, but those processes are moving, and it is a very dynamic regulatory environment, as it is in Europe, where during the week there was a whole new regulatory framework proposed for artificial intelligence. Quoting from the very informed Twitter stream of Dr. Kate Crawford, I'll just throw the bare bones out there and maybe get you guys to bounce off it. So AI systems are prohibited under this proposal if they violate human rights, do general social scoring for authorities, so social credit systems, or use live remote biometrics in public for policing. And there are also compulsory transparency obligations for AI systems that interact with humans, purport to detect emotions or interpret social categories based on biometric data, or generate or manipulate content. So if anything was a technology that could facilitate deep fakes, particularly around video, it would need to be clear that that's what was going on. Now, obviously this is a proposal. The EU creates framework laws that then need to roll out nation by nation. But on the face of it, this seems to be taking some of the principles that our own Human Rights Commission has been trying to forward and then some. So on first blush, Lizzie, what's your thoughts on what this framework looks like?
Yeah, I like the look of it. I think it's a first step in the right direction. I think there are lots of aspects to it that can be interpreted in different ways, which is a weakness of this kind of approach to regulating technology, but that's an inevitable weakness. So I understand that that's maybe part of the process. So I do think it's a good first step, and it's further than lots of other countries have gone. One of the things in there is that it bans use of live facial recognition, which I think is a good thing. And one of the things I think we need to see more of is red lines like that, banning the use of certain kinds of technology in certain settings. And there's a few of them in the proposal, because it's fine to say that it shouldn't be discriminatory, it shouldn't be this or that, but you know, I'm a lawyer and my job is suing people, and I see, you know, that it's much better to prevent a problem than give people a right to sue for damage caused after the event. So I think we do want to be catching these problems before they go out, and sometimes that means saying no to certain kinds of technology rather than just saying, you know, it needs to comply with these standards without a meaningful way to test for it, absent someone being harmed. Now, yeah, there's plenty of other things that I think are good about it, and I think it is interesting that our own Human Rights Commissioner has been looking at this kind of stuff. The stuff about transparency, of course, does add to that. You know, we've talked about this before, but in the consultation around Ed Santar's coming report, we talked about having an explanation for decisions that are made if they deal with a legal right or they affect someone's legal rights. And I think that kind of approach to ensuring that that a decision like this can be explained is pretty critical, because not only does that give pause to designers to start thinking about how they might be designing their systems and what kinds of inputs might be problematic, but also gives those people that if they are harmed by this after the fact, the opportunity to marshal evidence and push forward a claim for changing it and to agitate their claims for harm. So that kind of stuff I think is really important, transparency and accountability. But I think this is the first step, hopefully, in a more longer term trajectory.
Digital Rights Watch has been campaigning for a moratorium on facial recognition technology. How's that been going, and what sort of purchase have you been getting?
I think lots of people hate the idea of using it. I think there's something quite different to the handing over biometric information that is unalterable in the long term, as opposed to getting, for example, an account hacked where you can change your password. So I think people grasp instinctively why it's a problem. I think they're also concerned about law enforcement experimenting with this kind of technology. And, you know, we've seen examples of that. There was a scandal where it was revealed that, I think it was the AFP, it was certainly one police agency, was experimenting with a facial recognition technology that, you know, had all sorts of problems, was potentially the source of the information was problematic. This is Clearview AI, but also that potentially there were problems with the system itself. So, you know, I think if police authorities are going to start using this technology, then I think the public is going to expect that they've done the work to justify it, and that there aren't going to be problems, that it's not too early for this kind of technology to be implemented. So there's an issue here with facial recognition, I think. I think there's places where we just shouldn't have it, because even if it works really well, it shouldn't be something that can be used. But then, of course, there's this other ancillary part, which is actually where the debate is at, is that lots of agencies, state authorities are starting to use it, even though it's got problems in its design. And we have to kind of fight that war on both fronts. But I think there's a lot of public support for taking it slow on these measures and replicating what's happened in the US, where a number of companies have stopped selling facial recognition technology to law enforcement agencies.
And of course, if having a Netflix doco is a sign of an issue moving into the mainstream, there is a fantastic doco on Netflix at the moment, Coded Bias, which sort of lays out a lot of these arguments in quite a user-friendly way, because I think one of the issues with this is it sounds so complex, the actual science of AI and algorithms, that people don't quite engage in it, but it's actually about people and the way that we understand people. Dan, have you got a take on AI and how, I guess on two levels, one, how the raw data that drives AI is collected, but also then how it's applied, which is being looked at sort of in this report?
Look, I think Lizzie's given a pretty good summary of what Europe is proposing here. I mean, I just make the point. I think it's good as well, and I think just taking a step back from the specifics of artificial intelligence, what's I think really encouraging about this proposal is that for probably the first time ever, regulators are looking to get ahead of a problem before it becomes a problem, or getting ahead of an issue before it turns into a problem. And if you compare this with privacy, for example, where there was absolutely no regulation around the collection and use of consumer data, and as a consequence of that, we're having to backpedal now and try and figure out, implement laws and penalties for companies that have basically gone and done this massive land grab without any consideration about the potential harms that come with that. So, and I think this has the potential to be potentially even more invasive than just the data or the privacy invasions that we've seen so far, because artificial intelligence and algorithms are almost by definition discriminatory. I mean, all of the decisions that go into determining, particular decisions are based on some kind of input. And obviously, as that Netflix doco has pointed out, and as we've discussed in this forum many times before, that the problems with artificial intelligence and the problems with algorithms broadly is that you can human biases can be automated into the process. So, look, I think Lizzie's covered it much better than I possibly could. So I'm not going to go into it any more than that. But other than to say, I think this is really encouraging, and I hope that we're going to see similar actions down here in Australia.
The EU, for those that don't follow it closely, it is a representative parliament, but it does just, Lizzie, set frameworks, doesn't it? So to what degree would this be enforceable, and to what degree does it just become a model for the member nations?
So I didn't realise I need to get out my EU textbook. EU law textbook.
I just don't know. Yeah.
So I think it's a delicate dance, but you can set rules and then they have to be implemented locally. That's why I think there's room for interpretation, because different countries do have some capacity and will have difficulty perhaps incorporating laws made at a European level into a local context. And, so it's really, that's why for something like the GDPR, there is local implementation of it that sometimes looks different between nations, but there's an overarching commonality. That's my understanding of European law, but I don't profess to be an expert. Even though I am a European citizen, but anyway, yeah, there you go. Go on. Sorry.
No, I haven't really got anywhere further to go on that. Let's move on to Chippageddon then. What's going on here? We've got a shortage of chips and the world's going to collapse.
Yeah. I just think when I read Chippageddon, I was really excited because I thought it was like about potato chips or something, because that is like my favorite food. But of course it's not. It's about computer chips. So this is a really interesting phenomenon, I think, because people may not realize that the manufacturing of computer chips is concentrated in basically Korea and Taiwan. I think over 80% of all computer chips are manufactured there. And in the COVID period, there's been an immense demand for consumer technology, and actually a drop in the sale of cars, which I suppose it makes a lot of sense. But it means now that dynamic is changing again. Car manufacturers are struggling to get their hands on enough chips. So a lot of manufacturers who use, or people who make products that use computer chip technology, knew this was coming. And so they've been waiting for the arrival of a situation where we're running out of chips. And I think what it really brought home for me is, firstly, that hardware is manufactured in ways that I suppose I didn't expect. I didn't realize it was so concentrated. But secondly, maybe we need to start thinking about whether we need this culture of throwing away products that have chips in them, whether we need a culture where so many products have chips in them. You know, I'm sure members of the audience are aware, but there's lots of discussion around products that are connected to the internet that perhaps don't need to be. And there's a question about whether we should be pushing this path, or that there's, you know, whether this is vendor driven and the like. And so I think it's a really interesting moment to kind of contend with that, start rethinking perhaps how we use and interact with consumer technology, and perhaps alternatives to what is currently in the marketplace.
I think that notion of vendor driven is really interesting, because we often think of technology as the virtual space, whereas there are these whole layers of different materials that are being manufactured, and there's, you know, a degree of built-in redundancies in those, because that drives the business models. We know that there's a whole debate around right to repair devices, and whether manufacturers can effectively license tradies out of working on, you know, everything from your phone to your laptop. But there's also this sense, I think, that we don't see the industry behind the technology. And so, you know, we don't, I sort of started off the back of your link on Chippageddon saying, well, what else goes into computers? And you find all about, you know, the rare earth elements, and realize that Australia's manufacturing 10% of these, and they're incredibly toxic, hard to dispose of, but seen as essential for technology. So you've got all these building blocks, and you don't really have either a dialogue, or, for what I can see, you know, any form of, you know, both industry and environmental policy about the way those sectors work. So it kind of is still, much like technology, a bit of a wild west in the way all these things are put together.
Totally. I mean, I think there was a moment where Elon Musk came out in support of the coup in Bolivia, for example. People might recall a coup that happened a couple of years ago that the US, or certainly in the New York Times, it was portrayed as being a good thing, even though it was against a democratically elected leader in the context of contested elections. And, you know, Bolivia is a producer of a rare earth metal that goes into Tesla batteries, and it all seems a bit nakedly ambitious on his part. I mean, I think you can read too much into Elon Musk's Twitter account, of course, and it's pretty superficial, and I think easily discredited. But I think there is a war going on around some of these resources, particularly when it comes to rare earth, and there's also a huge problem in how these metals are produced, not just disposed of. A lot of instances of kids being used in mines and the like, all sorts of terrible labour practices. So I think it is important to think about these things not just as devices that come to us complete, but having carried with them a long supply chain with difficult materials to obtain and exploitative labour practices. So perhaps we should be thinking about enforcing the right to repair, which is obviously an occupation of the Productivity Commission right at the minute, and finding ways to reuse these things rather than constantly be producing new ones.
Dan?
I mean, it's also, in case this isn't obvious, it's also quite a significant geopolitical issue, right? So as Lizzie mentioned, chip manufacturing is actually quite concentrated. It's a relatively small number of foundries that produce all these chips, and they're mostly concentrated in Taiwan and Korea, as Lizzie mentioned, although increasingly in China and the US as well. And the reason is because as software eats the world, to quote Mark Andreessen, I think, you know, obviously the demand is exploding and we have these chip shortages. And the problem is they're becoming now fundamental to how we live our daily lives. So if, for example, this is the reason why I think the US is so focused on Taiwan, and I guess Australia needs to be too, because if there was a circumstance where we were cut off from the chip manufacturing capability of Taiwan, so many of these devices, because chips are in so many things now, and the supply of those would be in quite substantial jeopardy, and that has pretty significant consequences, I think, or potential consequences for Western democracies. That's why I think Intel's new CEO, Pat Gelsinger, I think he's made quite a big song and dance about his new strategic direction for Intel, where he's basically talking up the fact that they're going to be manufacturing a lot more chips on the US mainland, as well as manufacturing chips for others for the first time, which I think is a really good strategic move, but also it just speaks to the fact that this is something which governments around the world are also starting to pay attention to. But yeah, I'd also just to circle back, sorry to use that term, to come back to what Lizzie mentioned as well. We're not really having a debate around the downsides of chips being in absolutely everything that we do. I mean, beyond the supply issues, which are becoming particularly acute in some industries, there's obviously the same thing I always bang on about. There's so much data capabilities, data collection capabilities that are built into these chips being in fridges and microwaves and home speakers and all of those sorts of things. And yet, we don't really know or have any guardrails around what is done with that data, and that's another consideration, I guess. Do we really need to have a chip in a fridge? I'm not sure that we do.
So, is it starting a dialogue that's a bit like chip-free? We know that with our diet we should leave the chips alone. Is there actually a world in which you have chip-free technology as a point of difference, because by definition without the chip it's not going to be an extractive data tool?
Well, maybe
this is a good campaign.
I mean, it's a bit of a trade-off again. I mean,
put the chips aside.
It has a lot of crossover, I think, with data collection. I mean, it's almost the same thing, but what's the trade? What's the consumer trade-off? So consumer trade-off for data collection is you give us all of your data and you can use these products for free. And as we're finding out, that's a pretty poor deal because of the invasion of privacy. I guess the similar thing is, I guess there's some marginal efficiencies that come with, not marginal, probably substantial efficiencies or new capabilities that come with having chips in everything. And that's great. But what's the trade-off? What are we unknowingly giving away when we embrace all this? And I think even if we don't have chip-free diets, perhaps at least putting some thought into what some of the downsides of too many chips could be.
Why do burgers always come with chips? Like
maybe we have to potato chips, not computer chips. But yeah, I do agree with you. I mean, the other thing that comes to mind is I was talking on the radio this week about the new Apple Tile, and people were saying how that could be used for surveillance purposes. You could slip a tile into a woman's bag, for example, and track where she goes. And my response to that was, well, this happens all the time. In the domestic violence field, it's well known that technology is used to stalk people. And some of it's actively sold in that way, some software, but also like hardware, like toys that have internet connectivity for no good reason, in my view, that then can be used by partners to track their partners or spouses, even when they don't know that that's happening. It's not just about the need for that to be there at all, but also is that data secure? To what extent has the company managed to make sure that the product can be used properly, that is not able to be hacked by someone for a nefarious purpose? So I think there's a couple of debates around whether we need it at all, and then if you're going to use it for its proper purpose, that whether it's properly secured. And on both fronts, I think companies are failing consumers.
So what are devices that have got chips that don't need them at the moment? And are they offered without them?
There's a Barbie that has a chip. There's a great article where there's a hacker who hacks the Barbie and gets the Barbie to say all sorts of things that, whatever he wants, basically. So I think toys should be the first point where we stop putting chips in them, because children can't consent to that, and the security, the need for security is so high that I don't think we should trust companies to do that kind of thing. I mean, I'm all for getting rid of them from the fridge and the microwave. I must confess, I recently used a pet feeder when I was away that was internet connected, but I think actually that's quite important.
For your cat?
I can see the use of them. Yep, for my beautiful cat.
Your famous cat.
he's very handsome, and he's very demanding when it comes to food. I think there are legitimate, things that need to be connected to the internet for obvious reasons, but the right to be able to choose a product that doesn't have that capability is something that doesn't seem to be delivered by the market. So maybe there is scope to kind of, encourage production of devices that don't have it.
You were telling me, sorry, Jan, yeah, go on.
Sorry to jump in. I mean, I think I agree with everything Lizzie just said, but I think that the key thing that I'm most concerned about with whether it's chips or whatever else is just the smart home. And obviously there's huge benefits. You can feed your pet when you go on holidays, Lizzie. That's obviously a benefit. There's I use some of these things as well around the house as well. But the concern is that once again this is becoming quite a concentrated area. So you basically have Google and Amazon competing for your home now. And the concern I've got around both of those two companies that I don't really have with Apple, although I think they probably get the benefit of a little bit too much PR. But the problem with that is that if we all make our homes as smart as can possibly be, and we rely on Google's tech for that or Amazon's tech for that, we don't really know what Google and Amazon are getting out of this. But you can assume it's obviously being used to power their main businesses, which are advertising or selling products. And where is the discussion around the invasion of privacy around that? I was one of the first people, by the way, to go out there and get an Amazon Alexa and a Google Home, and they now sit on my shelf permanently unplugged because I'm just so nervous about it.
But what was the utility there? Like, could you see the value in it? Or like, as a couple of people are saying in the chat, they become obsolete really quickly. And, is it that hard to turn a bit of music on? Do you have to ask, Alexa to do it for you?
Well, look, there was certainly, I'm sure other people on the call have had this experience as well. I mean, there's certainly benefits when you're cooking a meal and you want to ask her something of the Alexa speaker or whatever else. But in the end, what ended up happening mostly was my kids just asked how long it was until Christmas. I mean, that was basically the use case of the Alexa speaker sitting on the speaker in my home in the end. So it wasn't much of a difficult decision to turn
you
it on.
You need a calendar, don't you?
Very analog technology there. Lizzie, when we were kicking this around, you also mentioned the Fair Phone movement. Do you want to just explain that?
Yeah, the Fair Phone. It's I think it's only available in the EU, but the Fair Phone is an alternative to other proprietary smartphones, where the idea of it is that you can replace and repair and reuse it, and that you can pull it apart, because you probably know if you've dropped your smartphone that you can't often get a battery replaced. It's expensive to get a screen replaced, obviously, but you can't always get inside and replace bits as they might be getting old. And the Fair Phone is designed to do that, to be able to create a long-term product that you can use when you can buy new parts for. And it makes so much sense, but it's not something that has been accelerated in the marketplace. I would love to see them in Australia, so we hope that they will come there. But I think there are alternatives out there, but it's a matter of making it easy for people to use. And at the moment, when there's so many restrictions on the right to repair, and there's no requirement to have things like replaceable batteries, companies that don't offer those things get further ahead in the marketplace, and that's unfortunate, because I think we all lose out when that's the case.
Great. Let's move on to our favorite ubiquitous global network, Facebook. And there's been quite a bit of stuff that's been really interesting over the past week, but I want to start with a story that I think Amy shared around the network yesterday, which was around an Australian Muslim rights group who've launched a formal complaint against Facebook under the Racial Discrimination Act, accusing Facebook of failing to take down hate speech against minority groups. So they've triggered the Anti-Discrimination Act against a platform. I'm not sure, Lizzie, if that's a first, but just in the context of Facebook saying that their new whiz-bang improved Supreme Court is going to get more and more active, it just seemed an interesting way in.
Yeah, their response is to say, we have automated systems for taking down hate speech, but it is very difficult, as you can probably imagine, to identify what is and isn't hate speech using automated systems. So, I think one of the things that might come out of this, or this is where I think this kind of action trends, is to say, well, you're allowed to have a platform that gives people the right to post things themselves, but you do need to have in place proper content moderation systems so that certain things aren't permitted to stay up for longer than they should. And you know, Facebook is notoriously underinvested in those kinds of systems. And instead, they prefer to talk about automated ones because it makes the company look forward thinking. It's obviously hugely cheap for them as compared to employing people to do this work. And I think we do need to see a shift in balance away from that towards more conscientious, human content moderation. That's really the only answer, in my view, to these kinds of big scale questions. There are some, and also, you know, particularly because Facebook operates in countries all over the world, what might constitute discriminatory conduct or hate speech or whatever it is in different places is contextual politically. It's also legally contextual. So it's not good enough also to apply a single form of content moderation that comes out of an American vision of what is hate speech and what isn't in local jurisdictions. So that's been a notorious problem for Facebook. And I think it is high time they invest more in these things, but they generally don't. And the people that they pay to do this work are often appallingly underpaid, have to work in terrible conditions, and aren't, you know, going to work in the Facebook company headquarters because that's reserved for a different kind of employee. So, yeah, this is their business model, not being required to pay the costs of content moderation that might make this place or the space of Facebook a safer one that is more welcoming for people from all different backgrounds.
And we'll get to your radical solution in a little bit, which is, I really enjoyed reading your article last night. I should stick it in the chat before we actually get to you and people can multitask. Dan, while this has been going on in Australia, you've also been having the George Floyd trial. Derek Chauvin found guilty in the last 48 hours, although all the days are floating into one. On that occasion, Facebook identified a huge risk, I think, both to reputation and to public and to public interest, and actually put a team to manage down what was going on around that case. So it shows that where there is a moment, moderation, much more active moderation is possible, which goes beyond the algorithmic. This is almost the impossible challenge that their business has, in that search for being as ubiquitous a network as possible means that you're trying to engage people to the edge of acceptable behavior and then find a way of pushing it back. But I'm interested in your thoughts on that tension, particularly between automated moderation and then humans coming in when it's really important, and how you fuse those two together.
Yeah, look, I think this is a really, the second example, actually, I think, where Facebook have taken their responsibilities seriously. I think the other one was in the lead up to the US election, where they clearly put a hell of a lot more human resourcing towards moderating things. They dropped the ball afterwards, obviously, and that helped facilitate the storming of the Capitol. But at least leading up to the election, I think they demonstrated that on a particular issue, at least, they can take their responsibilities seriously. We've said this many times before, but I'm going to say it one more time with feeling. I mean, really, you just basically need to apply that level of responsibility to your entire network and every country that you operate. And again, 35,000 moderators sounds like a big number until you realize you've got 2.8 billion people on your platform. I think that's like less than 0.0001% of people. And the problem with, you know, the sort of Pollyanna view of machine learning and you know, automation will fix this is it clearly doesn't. It clearly doesn't fix it. And so really what Facebook needs to do is what I've said many times before. I'm probably going to bore all of the audience members. I'm going to say it one more time. They basically need to be far less profitable. They need to employ millions of moderators. The other thing that I think they need to do is they need to take, they've had a bias, I guess, against moderation historically, and a bias towards free speech, I guess, for want of a better term. And, you know, if you're charitable, you could say that's because they've sort of had a bit of a Pollyanna view, if you like, of what the potential discourse on social media can be. If you're cynical, and I think probably more accurate, you can go, well, we're not going to put too much, have a bias towards taking down content, because the more extreme the content, the greater the engagement, the better for our business. And so I think, you know, this is just it's a really good example of Facebook actually doing their job. I just wish they would do it more often. And hopefully this this demonstrates that they can, and they just accept the fact that they're going to have to be far less profitable and employ far more moderators and rely less on machines to do the job that humans should be doing.
Well, speaking of humans, Lizzie, I've just put your fantastic Baffler piece in the chat. So drawing inspiration from the communards, you propose a paid elected role, like position effectively of moderator on a social network. Do you want to talk people through the logic and we can kick that around a little bit?
Sure. So the purpose of that article really is to highlight, I think, something probably we all may agree on, which is that companies are not well equipped or really designed to do content moderation. It's not really in their interest to do so. And even if they try and do it, it's not usually done well for that reason as well. So we need to start thinking about, instead of calling always on Facebook to moderate content, think about how the whole thing could be done differently by different people. And so at the end of the article, the premise of the article is actually about a painting that was taken down called The Origins of the World by a French painter who ended up being involved in the Paris, well, he was in the Paris Commune is what I'm drawing in there. So I'm trying to revive the spirit that got his painting taken down off Facebook, and such question why. The reason is it's an up-close portrait of a woman's genitals, but it's done in oils. You know, it's obviously a 19th century painting. So it's a funny little insight into perhaps how Facebook works. It's actually quite prudish than even people centuries ago, because it's got a particular set of values that it imposes on its platforms that are so ubiquitous they go without comment. And my argument is, well, let's think about what, you know, how we could have a more diverse and interesting idea of what is artistic, of what is political, of how we have these discussions. They're essentially ones that the company is ill-equipped to have. Anyway,
just to interrupt there, just to go into that, and what I loved about that was that particularly when you automate it, you are never going to get context and you are never going to get texture, and it's just narrowing down the experience rather than opening it up, right?
Completely, and flattening it out. So it becomes this kind of very American-centric vision of what these things are that might otherwise allow us to engage in serendipitous meetings of minds and exploring new facets of our personality or interests or different kinds of artwork. You know, at the end, I kind of am spitballing ideas about how we could do it differently. And one of the things that occurs to me is I don't spend a huge amount of time on Facebook anymore these days. I may not be alone there. I'm sure I'm not. But one of the things I do is I spend time in groups. And I think that's how a lot of people engage with Facebook, and increasingly it's part of Facebook's business model. Rather than looking at a feed, you're in a group of people with similar interests. My primary one is actually dog spotting, because I love looking at pictures of dogs. But actually one that comes to mind is it's a group for women riders that came about some time ago, but it's got a lot of members who talk about riding and the experience of doing that. And the people who moderate that group spend a huge amount of time doing that work. And they're very sensitive. They set out guidelines. They have discussions when they think people might have violated those guidelines. They're there removing people. They're shutting down discussions if they think they're in breach. It's a very open process where those people exercise power, but do it in a way that is consultative, that is transparent, that has mechanisms for recourse that are informal, but still I think it's a really important part of building a community in which you can have trust in how that content is moderated. And to my mind, we need more of those people. And maybe you do need to pay them. Maybe they need to be appointed roles. Maybe they need to be elected by the particular group, but invest resources, because that's actually critical community building work. And paying people kind of changes the dynamic, but it's not really my point to raise that specifically, but more to say that work is really valuable, and Facebook benefits from it because it makes people want to be on the platform.
The amount of social capital that's being pumped into Facebook to just build its extraction machine. Matt's making the point that he's moderated a group of 2,000 people, and it's an incredibly taxing commitment. And if you don't have someone stepping up, it's like running the freaking PNC, which is another great piece of social capital that just spins out of control if it's not totally, managed well. Dan, you know, Guardian's grappled with moderation for a long time. I know on your comments, if it's a particularly hot issue, you just turn it off because it gets too hard. Do you want to talk through like that sort of, do you have moderation specialists in there, or how does it work with you guys?
Yeah, we do. I mean, we've got a team of moderators. Obviously, we're dealing with far less content than Facebook is, but we've got a team of moderators that are dedicated to proactively moderating comments. And, you know, for particular articles, I won't say what, but for particular articles, we just simply don't turn comments on because we know it's going to become a sword pretty quickly. And that by the way, we take that approach also to the content that we post to Facebook. So Facebook is still a really important distribution channel for us. We don't put up articles that are likely to result in user comments which are likely to be, well, they can be defamatory, they can be racist. There's a long list of things that can go wrong when you allow user comments to take place. And the reason we do that, by the way, is because I would argue we take moderation seriously, because if we were to put some of those articles up on Facebook, we would need to employ 10, 20 more people than we do. We can't justify that expense. So therefore we just accept the fact that we're going to have less traffic coming through from Facebook, earn less money, by the way, because there's a responsibility for us to do that. Moderation's hard though, right? It's hard. And also it's a tremendously, I take your point, Lizzie, it's a tremendously valuable thing to do. And the reason I think it works well within groups, because I'm like you, the only time I actually spend time on Facebook is if it's a particular group that I'm interested in. I was about to reveal some of the groups I'm in, but I'm not, because it will tell too much about myself. But
not dog
nonetheless,
spotting? No.
Okay, I'm going to. So I'm a member of a group of an early 90s dance music in Western Australia. There's a whole, I've lost, I know.
That's niche.
I know.
But you guys.
There's like four nightclubs in Western Australia back in the 90s, and everyone that was at those nightclubs is in this group. But my point is, don't know why I threw that out there. Anyway, my point is, the administrators of that group spend a huge amount of time on their moderated comments and reminding people of the kinds of things that make sense to be posting to them, and why they take some things down and why they do other things that they leave up. And there's discussion about it, to your point. There's discussion about it. There's a community moderation, because we're all passionate about this particular very niche, strange topic. How do you, I guess I've got a question for you though, Lizzie. I haven't read your paper, I'm sorry, I'm looking forward to reading it after this. How does it work at scale? Like, what are you proposing Facebook does outside of the groups environment? Give me a sense of it.
Oh, I actually think content moderation at scale is virtually impossible on one read. I mean, yeah, it's interesting. There's an Atlantic article which Peter might post. Peter's clearly doing my link posting work, that talks about some of these issues in relation to what we were talking about before, you know, Facebook putting its back into certain periods of time, including most recently around the conviction of the police officer who killed George Floyd, murdered, and then, you know, whether it could do that more often. But I actually think part of my argument was you can't really do it from the headquarters in Silicon Valley, have a content moderation scheme that applies all around the world, because actually values, ideas are culturally specific. It's one of the reasons why people are quite critical of Facebook for being complicit, is the argument, in the genocide in Myanmar, because they don't really put any effort into content moderation there. And even if you did, picking up the dynamic that gave rise to some of the racial dynamics in that country, you do need some qualifications, some local context and knowledge to be able to do that work effectively. And it's very easy to miss if you apply a kind of very bland, I would say, American ideal of prioritizing freedom of speech over other things. So one of my arguments, I suppose, is that to do it at scale is not really possible. Maybe what we need is a kind of federation of content moderators to work together to perhaps have some connection into a broader scheme, but with an understanding that you've got responsibilities that are quite local, contextual, that give rise to how you make decisions. So, you know, apart from toning down things like virality, you know, stopping micro-targeting, stopping automated generated audiences for ads, things like that are part of Facebook's business model, which has inadvertently given rise to certain approaches to content moderation because it's part of Facebook's business model. I think we probably have to start thinking about proactively doing it from the bottom up instead of perhaps the top down, is how I'd put it in short.
And then you've got the challenge of moderating civilly, with civility, being pushed up against a business model that is around amplification and heightening engagement. So the technical solution won't work, ground up may work. And the other thing that strikes me is that moderation on one level is just stopping bad stuff happening, but it is, I said ship, but there is another opportunity with the really good groups where you're actually community building and actually creating social capital. And that's not about moderation. That's actually about growing and nurturing and doing something more than just sort of running the doors. You're growing something and building something. And that is a public service, and it isn't being recognized, at least on the global platforms. It sort of segues into the thinking that we've spoken about a number of times around thinking about a public purpose, public square, and some talk before in the post about the new public movement in the States and Europe. But, is there a world in which you have public networks where either government funded community builders, like the online equivalent of a community worker down at the local, community center is building social capital off the platforms? And that doesn't even come in because at the moment you've just got a whole bunch of content being thrown at a platform and they're just trying to stop the outbreaks when things blow up.
I'd be interested to hear from Nicola if you can unmute her, because I don't know whether she's going to want to talk about it. But I agree. I mean, because
she also had a great idea for a drinking game, and we need to bring her into this discussion. Yeah.
I'll just give her a minute to get ready if she wants. But because one of the things she says in her comment is talking about coming up against the business model of the platform that you're doing this content moderation work on. And, this brings to mind the oversight board, which is kind of Facebook's internal court system for determining some of these questions. And to my mind, having a company that's owned by shareholders, the idea that you could have an oversight board that makes decisions that are binding on the company just doesn't seem to work. They owe their duty, people who are working for the company owe their duty to shareholders, not some oversight board. So that's why you have laws, so that companies are then required to comply with rules that don't just prioritize shareholder value. Anyway, Nicola may have
Nicola's up.
To say that.
Hello.
Yeah. Hello. How are you all?
Yeah, great.
So
tell us what it's like in online gaming.
So Dan's dirty secret is, West Australian dance scene in the 90s. And my dirty secret is a long history of online gaming, starting with text only, muds and mushes, and moving on to things like EverQuest and World of Warcraft. And then I had kids and then I had to stop. But, this is a community where it was in the company's interest to have paid community moderators. Their entire business model was based around that network effect, that an online game doesn't work if there's only one person playing it. They actually need people to be working together in order to achieve a common goal. And part of the way that they helped keep people engaged was through having forums as well as, in-game communication. And they would pay community moderators to manage their forums, and these people would often help also a team of ground up volunteer-based moderators who would, have specific remits. And it was well documented in its heyday that, community moderators were hard to find because there's a lot of emotional labour, and hard to retain, and they would burn out. Because they're often the sandwich and the meat in the middle of the sandwich. They've got things that they're supposed to be achieving on behalf of the company, but they didn't have a lot of power. Meanwhile, they're the ones copying all the flack from the user base. And when you promote volunteers within this kind of structure, they like the idea of it until they get the power, and then they don't want to hand the power over. So I was looking at that model and thinking, when that one, which had a lot of things working in its favor, that they could control the kind of content that people were allowed to talk about, that their moderators were paid, that they had ground support, that the community itself was actually looking at trying to help one another out in the main, rather than running around and intentionally trying to cause conflict. And it was still hard to manage. How does Facebook work?
It does come down to the purpose of the network, doesn't it, though? Jordan was making the point before, all of the Reddit communities, there's lots of volunteer moderation going on within them as well. It might be that the idea of a ubiquitous network that is just collecting everything just is unmoderatable, and smaller networks are the alternative. I don't know. Tell us about your drinking game idea too, though. I'm totally up for that.
There are some topics that just come up week after week.
And, to that point, I think we're conscious that we all play in the zone we're most comfortable in. So ACCC, Google, Facebook. But if people do have thoughts on other topics, we should create some sort of feedback loop, maybe on the Twitter. When we start putting out the promos, just let us know what's going on, because we're all exploring this from lots of different angles as well. But maybe a drinking game would work on a Friday. Just on the that public space thing as well, I should let people know that we are at the Australia Institute putting out a paper on public spaces next Thursday. We're really excited. We're going to be doing the launch with a webinar at 10 a.m. on the Thursday with Eli Parisa from the Civic Signals Project in the States. He's the guy that wrote the book Filter Bubbles as well. And Lizzie and I are going to kind of kick the ideas around with him, and hopefully our challenge is, and I think we've raised this before, is that we need to imagine a publicly funded public square, and it probably starts with looking at what the ABC does and building off there. So it might create a lot of conversation. It might fall without a much of a splash, but we will see. And I think throwing the ideas out there and actually pushing debates along is part of why we're all involved in this. But that's at 10 o'clock. I'll just put an invite to that in the link there too. So that's one that we're going to run through the centre, and we'll also send out both a report and a deck when that gets rolling. So that actually fits in Privacy Week as well, Lizzie.
Yeah.
So let's go back to Privacy Week. What have you guys got planned? And then there's probably going to be something almost every day next week, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, we're just going to be talking about.
Oh, you just moved.
I did just move. Sorry, I had a battery issue. So you can see some of my other artwork, which relates to the dismissal. You might be able to see John Kerr behind me.
Every room in your house is interesting, by the way, Lizzie. It seems like every time there's something interesting on the wall behind you, and I need to. Hey, we need to spruce things up. I think we're letting the team down. You in particular, by the way, that lamp in the corner is. I
know. I've gone very. This has always been.
Sorry, Lizzie. Back to you. More important matters.
Yeah, we do. It's true, Nicola. We do need more cat content. If I could rouse my cat out of his slumber, I'd bring him on. But yeah. Look, I think it's really interesting to talk about privacy at this particular moment. I'll just throw one thing into the mix, which is I often talk about how privacy is a more expansive right than people often think about, because it's assumed that it's about sealing off a world from view, concealing information and holding it back, rather than the capacity to share it on your own terms. And I was reading about this in relation to vaccine passports, actually, which is, I think we've only been released from the possibility of having to contend with vaccine passports in Australia because we haven't had any vaccines. But I think that's something that's going to be coming at some point. But there's a really interesting article. I'll find and post the link in a sec, which I heard about on a great podcast actually called Tech Won't Save Us. And she talks about how vaccine passports are about also like privacy as a version of economic and social rights, that it is about, that potentially these systems of determining whether someone's been vaccinated might be incorporated into digital identity agendas, which relate to the delivery of welfare services, all sorts of other social engagements that you might have with the state as a form of surveilling citizens. And so the facts that vaccine passports are being pushed so strongly by certain countries and certain states and the like is suggestive of this potential push towards digital identity. And anyway, I was really relieved to see somebody talking about privacy, not just as a kind of first generational civil political right, but actually as something that relates to our economic and social rights as well, more expansive. But it's not just about you're keeping information within your home or your psyche, but actually it's about the capacity to engage with the state, engage with each other on terms of our choosing, and that data and the capturing of data and setting up a digital identity systems fundamentally undermines that. So that's the kind of thing that I think I would like to talk about at Privacy Awareness Week. And I'm excited that this conversation about privacy is starting to be a bit more sophisticated than perhaps it might have been even a few years ago.
Excellent. Well, I think we're almost up to the hour. Have a great Privacy Week, Lizzie. Have a good week, Dan. Anything for you to leave the crew with?
We're finishing how we started. No, I mean, other than to say, I think this idea of a public square or a publicly funded social network is one that the more and more that I think about it, and the more I discuss it with other people, by the way, the more sense it makes. So I'm looking forward to hearing you and Lizzie and Eli discussed this on Thursday of next week. I think this is something which, if we can have a social network which isn't built off advertising engagement or maximising engagement at all costs to drive advertising, I think we're going to have a much better society. So I look forward to hearing what you guys have to say about it.
Yeah, excellent. Well, we'll see you guys next Thursday, and Friday week will be the next Tech Talk. But thanks for coming, everybody, and stay in touch.